Welcome to The Detail. I am your host, Kathy Antunes, and you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5, LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. Well, we've all heard about community concern about overbuilding and sprawl. And as years have gone by, back in 2013, 2014, Sarasota's 2050 plan underwent major changes. And the chickens are coming home to roost, so to speak. And it's an apt analogy because this affects our rural area. With me today is Charles Gauthier. Mr. Gauthier is working with residents of Sarasota County who are concerned about urban sprawl impacting our rural area. This is going to be an issue at the County Commission meeting next week. So Charles Gauthier, you are a professional planning expert. Thanks for joining me today. And can you just share with the audience about your background? What
Certainly.
You've been doing this for a while.
I am a high mileage model. I've actually worked in the areas of environmental planning, comprehensive planning, development review for 44 years now in Florida. So I started in 1978. My career has been a mixture of government and consulting work. I've worked at quite a while in environmental agencies, working on water supply issues, Lake Okeechobee, restoration, Kissimmee River, and so on. But then I changed my career to be more into land use planning. I thought that was just so fascinating. I went to work early on for the Department of Community Affairs and worked with long-range planning for major areas like Hutchinson Highland and Charlotte Harbor, and the Swanee River and the Kissimmee River.
Wow.
And you know what? The Growth Management Act passed in 1985. I thought, I really need to work for a local government. So I was honored to receive a job offer from Collier County and became their chief planner and manager of planning.
So that's, for those who don't know, Naples is Collier County to our south.
And so I went from a state worker in a cube to being at the podium every Tuesday before the county commission. What a shock that was. But as it worked out, I was the sort of lead on preparation of the county's land plan for their growth management plan and preparation of the regulations to implement it. I decided to go work for Lee County. I spent 5 years as zoning administrator. I like to say that was the hardest job I've ever had.
Was it really? Why was that hard?
I presented over 300 rezoning requests to the Board of County Commissioners, many of them very controversial. So it's always
That's where the rubber meets the road, right? You've got neighbors on each side talking to each other. It gets kind of tough.
So it's been an educational pathway for me. I decided to return to Tallahassee. That's where I reside now. Went to work for the Department of Community Affairs, and I was fortunate to have senior level positions at DCA as a growth management administrator and bureau chief, and then later the division director for the state growth management program. So I spent 17 years at DCA. I should mention I also worked for a couple major consulting firms representing private sector and public sector clients. But the last 8 years, I've really had the time of my life. I work on my own now. Being able to pick and choose my clients. Most of my work is litigation oriented. So I spend a lot of time before administrative law judges, circuit court judges, and have had a whole variety of clients. It's really amazed me. I've represented counties, cities, development interests, and public interest groups. The last few years, I've really focused on the public interest groups because there's just a demand for that. And that's where my heart is. I just like to help people. So I guess I don't know that I'm a superstar, but I have a lot of staying power.
Well, you certainly
I've seen a lot.
Yeah, you certainly have a very rich and in-depth background when it comes to what's going on in the state of Florida with the environment and with land use. So before we get into what's going on specifically in Sarasota, because you're you and you have this experience, I'd love to pick your brain a little bit. How would you describe the Florida that you began working in 1978, and then as you said, in 1985, the Growth Management Act passed. So tell me about the Florida of those days on up to, say, and you work for DCA, the Department of Community Affairs, and we don't have that anymore. So can you tell me about that progression and what it's been like to witness it?
It's a totally different world here now in Florida. I mean, the population has tripled since I started work. But reflecting back, a lot of the environmental protection and land use planning, it really commenced in a time of a crisis. 1969, 1970, there's major drought conditions in South Florida, big fires. The legislature was very motivated to act. And at the same time, there was large-scale development starting to happen. Large platted communities, such as Deltona, down developing Marco Island, GAC, GDC, you name it. Golden Gate Estates, Northport, etc.
So Marco Island was beginning to be developed in the 70s? Is that what you're
in the late 60s.
Okay.
And in fact, Marco Island, originally called Caxambas, was a little settlement. And Deltona remade the whole place through extensive dredge and fill. And this was so alarming. The dredge and fill happening around Marco Island and also Boca Ciega Bay, just to the north of you there in Pinellas County. And that's what led to the Florida Pollution Control Act and the first dredge and fill permitting type requirements. And you know what? Those requirements stopped Deltona from still further excavation of destroying and excavating mangrove areas and waterways, and creating fingers of land and canals. Now, it was a big turn of events. Also during that era, there became a state interest in reviewing large-scale development through Development for Regional Impact and the Environmental Land and Water Management Act. In 1975, when I was still in school, there was the first law was adopted for mandatory comprehensive plans in the state of Florida. Before that
was 1975.
Yes, before that, plans were authorized but not required. The 75 Act required that each local government have a plan. Now, the standards for the plan were not much. The plans weren't binding, but it was a step.
It was the beginning.
And then the much bigger step happened later in 1985, and that was the Growth Management Act. And all of a sudden, every city, every county, 460 or so of them, had to have a comprehensive plan in place that met a range of substantive requirements. And it was binding on development. There had to be a future land use plan. The future land use plan was to identify what could be built where. There had to be an environmental plan relating to land use protection of habitat and wetlands. There had to be detailed plans for public facilities to make sure they kept up with the demands of growth. So the 1985 law was just huge. It was shocking, actually. Now that law, and I'm sort of going through the time continuum, telling you how.
Can I stop you there for a second, Charles? Or you go by Charlie?
Charlie.
Okay, Charlie. Can you tell me, because I want to hear about that change requiring comprehensive plans, but what was it about the pollution? You're saying the dredge and fill was happening the late 60s, the 70s, and then everyone was getting alarmed because of droughts and big fires. But then you mentioned pollution. Can you describe, what was the nature of the pollution that made people say, hey, wait a minute, something has to be done.
The pollution, well, is happening directly and indirectly.
Okay.
Indirectly was simply the destruction of wetlands, the destruction of traditional waterways, taking
Okay.
away their assimilative capacity, the values that they brought. But
Mm-hmm.
more directly, there were standards for wastewater treatment. Standards began to be developed for stormwater management. And before that, it was raw sewage in a pipeline.
Oh,
That's how
okay.
it worked for the city of Key West for many years. So
Okay.
it's sort of multifaceted, involved point sources like sewer plants, indirect non-point sources like stormwater, as well as protection of just our environmental features. As I was mentioning, the 85 law, well, it was approved in 85. Implementing regulations are adopted, but it wasn't until 89 and 90 and 91 until the cities and counties adopted their initial growth management plans. So it took 5 or 6 years for them to roll into effect. And that was indeed a culture change. Now, local governments, counties in South Florida, had a level of sophistication and capability. But I can tell you through Central Florida and the Panhandle, it was rough going.
Oh, really?
It's like, no one.
So you're saying the Panhandle really didn't, like there were different levels of understanding and standards across the state. It wasn't uniform.
And political acceptance,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, and the battles then, there were many battles. The Growth Management Act enabled state oversight of local plans. So you had to have a plan, it was binding on development, and the plan had to be approved by the state. And the original battles were urban development boundaries. How big an urban area can there be? Where is that yellow area? How do you draw the lines on the map? And that was played out in Miami-Dade County with their urban development boundary and all the agricultural areas toward Homestead. It was played out certainly in Collier County with the Big Cypress Swamp and all those features. And where should the limit of intense development be? So up and down the state that was played out, and those plans were put in place. And we've worked from those originally adopted plans ever since. Now, the law has certainly changed.
I have a question for you. So, if you look at, and there's a blog that I love called Strong Towns, and Charles Marone, you're familiar with him. I see you nodding.
Yes.
He, and thinking in the planning world, if you visit a city or a community that was built prior to the car, or there are two factors, and there may be more, but the automobile and then also leveraged financing. So when people had to build in a way that was immediately solvent, they couldn't leverage themselves, and the building had to kind of pay for itself, and people had to have the money to maintain it, or they needed they would build little shops and then live on top, so that there was an inherent value in that kind of development. And so you saw city or town centers, and you see this in Europe, that these successful areas that people have lived in for many centuries, they have a central town area or marketplace, commercial place. And then the intensity, you've got the urban area, and then not that far away is the countryside where the food is grown and the animals are raised. And to me, when you don't have those kind of market changers, the automobile and how it's changed how we can transport ourselves and work far away from where we live, but also being able to just really borrow and leverage yourself has also changed the way people build. Isn't there just an inherent wisdom and kind of going back to what works financially, because at the end of the day, this sprawl model, this overdevelopment model that we have so much of in Florida, requires the tax base actually does not create enough value to pay for its maintenance. I mean, I think we're seeing that, but it's like it's a bigger view, right? It's like a bigger picture view that gets missed a lot. I mean, what do you think about that line of thinking and approach to development?
Well, I think that's certainly very valid. You can't turn back the clock.
Yeah, no, right.
Planners, we have our ideals, and the ideals would be compact development, a variety of housing types, a center for that development to allow for shopping, for employment, the ability to walk and not drive.
Right. Yeah.
The genie is out of the bottle on that. And, the rapid growth of Florida, it's grown so fast. The easy availability of automobile travel and the influx of retirees who don't necessarily have to work. They receive transfer payments. So I think the dynamics have changed very, very much. So that traditional ideal model of a small community that grows organically and is separated by open space, that just doesn't happen on its own. And it's very difficult to achieve it and through a land use planning regulatory approach.
Yeah.
That's the planning ideal. Hard to achieve it.
Yeah. And so let's talk now about why you're working for some citizens, some landowners out in Old Miakka. And I think a lot of people, certainly listeners of the show, know that there's a movement in Old Miakka. They call it Keep the Country Country. And these are folks who have moved here, maybe lived here for generations, lived here for a while, and they want a particular lifestyle. And we have a comprehensive plan. As you talked about, every county has to have one. It actually mandates that Sarasota County offer rural lifestyles in addition to the urban, that there's going to be a variety of land uses. But the folks in Old Miakka feel that their way of life and the rural life is under attack. And there's a new application, a new development application. So can you tell us about, what's being proposed out there and why the people who live out there contacted you?
Yes, I've agreed to assist the group, Save the Country. They asked me, from my perspective, having worked with large scale development around the state, to provide an assessment, a sort of independent assessment of the proposed village transition zone future land use map amendment. So that's what I've been going about doing. And they're concerned. They're very concerned about their reliance. They have been relying on the Sarasota 2050 plan for 20 years now. And they have made lifestyle choices and property investment choices dependent on that. And they see that rug being pulled out from under them. That's their concern. And I should back up again, if you'd allow me. I mean, the 2050 plan, it's a 20-year-old plan. And it was prepared through a very intensive process. Back at that time, plans had evolved. We had those urban development boundaries in place, but they kept getting expanded by accretion. A chunk here, make it a little bigger here, expand it there. No one had a sort of top of the jigsaw puzzle box of what the ultimate build out of their county or their community should look like. So there was a great frustration, and Sarasota County was certainly a leader, very progressive, very sophisticated. There were other communities. Sarasota County took their 2050 plan approach, but others took optional sector planning as a tool or rural land stewardship, and all of them were striving to get away from the incremental comprehensive plan amendments that just grow and grow an urban area toward who knows what, and pretty soon you have no rural area. You lose your farm areas. Thinking back, there was quite a process to prepare that 2050 plan.
Sure.
I mean, there was like a stakeholders group. There was like a urban land institute study. There was a vision that the county adopted. Finally, in 2002, the 2050 plan was adopted. Then regulations were put in place. And the county has been going about trying to implement it ever since. And planning meets reality. You start looking at particular tracts of land, particular issues, and there came a need from time to time for the county to evolve the 2050 plan, to sort of adjust it and tune it. And I think that's natural. Plans aren't locked in place forever. You have to make adjustments. So you know, I don't have a great concern about all that. But the point is, it was a very elaborate, collaborative process. I think of the 2050 plan as a grand bargain that was made by all the interests in the county, rural interests, agricultural interests, conservationists, the general public, developers. It was a grand bargain. It was a balance. Everyone compromised. So as I've reviewed the amendment before the county now, you know, I'm alarmed that it will lead to the eventual collapse of the overall 2050 planning approach.
This particular proposal that you're.
Yes, ma'am. I mean, initially, I mean, it's like 4,120 acres. That's a lot of land. That's 6 square miles.
Yeah.
Under the 2050 plan, the area was identified for potential development as a hamlet, what was defined as a hamlet. Now, the 2050 plan is optional. Property owners can stay in place. They can keep their rural land use plan. They could build 1 unit for 5 acres. They could farm, some other activities. Or as an option, they could opt into, on this site, a hamlet. And hamlets are carefully designed. It's supposed to be small scale clusters with a central focal point, extensive open space, green belts, very carefully done. But it was a developer option. On this site, over 4,000 acres, about 1,648 residential units would be possible. Again, using a very carefully designed footprint of development that would balance the different interests, and at the same time demonstrating that it would be fiscally neutral to the county. So this hamlet designation has been in place and as an option. People have seen it, they've relied on it. And now comes along this amendment and it blows a hole, a 4,000 acre hole in the plan. Instead of hamlet design, it would simply allow 5,000 residential units, no particular requirements for the form or layout or development design. Instead, it just vaguely refers to similar to Lakewood Ranch in Manatee County. There is no requirement for employment or shopping on this 4,000 acres. So this would be a blanket of suburban development with green belts, without that urban design. A total change. Now, my comment about how it would debilitate the overall 2050 plan, it's really a comment about reliance and fairness. I mean, the plan has been in place, people have relied on it. Elsewhere, property owners have come forward and achieved a village approval or other hamlet approvals. They went through that process. This amendment is really an end run around this.
Yeah.
I mean,
so I'm gonna stop you for a second because I believe that it's being proposed by, is it Mr. Neal or Mr. Jensen?
Lakewood Ranch.
Lakewood Ranch. Okay. So we're talking, you know, Lakewood Ranch has begun toward University Boulevard. They're building something called the Villages. but we're talking about the very east end of Lakewood Ranch in the very rural area, again, coming south. They want to come south. And would you say, I mean, it's been my observation, this is not an area of, I've studied as someone who's lived here and I've written about development, but in your professional opinion, what seems to me is you've got people who are just, they're used to building a certain way. Some people here, prominent developer, Benderson Development, they built strip malls and they built the University Town Center. When it was first approved, University Town Center was supposed to be walkable, like a little town. That's where the name came from. It was supposed to be like city blocks and walkable with, a true downtown sort of feel, a little small town sort of feel. But what we got was the last mall built in the United States. We got a mall. And I just look at it and go, well, but that's what he's used to building, And it seems like these folks come in and they're influential and they promise, oh, we'll do this, we'll do that. But then in the end, they just want the approvals to come so they can keep building the way they're used to building, because one of the things that you had said that caught my attention was a hamlet is very carefully designed. Is that a fair assessment of these kind of proposals? The one that's in front of the county commission, it's just, hey, we want to build gated communities. That's what we do. So let us do that.
This is the opposite of
Okay.
careful design. I mean, this is, instead of a collaborative stakeholder process, a public process, this is a privately initiated plan amendment.
Mm-hmm.
It's customized for one particular development style. It allows solely 5,000 residential units, no other uses are necessary. And the actual design is kind of left vague. So no, this isn't carefully planned. Now, on the other side of the coin, Lakewood Ranch is highly successful. I mean, there's consumer choice. And I think that is a fair consideration too. We don't have a balance now, though, in my opinion, with this amendment between long-range planning, the public's reliance, design, and the development interests. I think that balance needs to be found. I mean, I'm concerned about this particular 4,100 acres, but what happens next? If you look at the map, there's more hamlet areas that aren't included in this amendment further east. This Lakewood Ranch Southeast, who knows? It could double in size as the years go by. So this could just continue to grow as sort of an exception or hole in the overall 2050 plan.
So Charlie,
if I'm a developer who holds an approval for a village or hamlet elsewhere, I see this. I want my requirements.
You want it too. Yeah.
I want it too. So the precedential value is huge here. So that's an important consideration.
Yeah. Tell me about, because, I think actually a lot of people do appreciate how it impacts traffic. And we just have a minute before I need to take a quick break. But, for someone who's not living in the immediate area, why should they care about this? Why should somebody who's just living in Sarasota County care about preserving the rural area? And, but I'm also really wondering about traffic.
People want a variety of landscapes. I believe people are most comfortable when you have that diversity: agricultural lands, rural lands, environmental lands, and development lands. I think everyone in the county has a general interest in what happens around them. In regard to roadways, I've characterized this as a, blanket of suburban development, 5,000 houses, automobile dependent development for them. And Fruitville Road is going to take a tremendous burden. The county has level of service standards that apply to Fruitville Road so that congestion is defined. And the planning is supposed to avoid violating those level of service standards. But as we sit here right at this moment, already an important segment of Fruitville Road is below the level of service standard.
Mm-hmm.
As years go by, that will extend.
That'll just get worse, right?
It'll be further and further. So the congestion will both intensify and eventually extend to cover more and more of Fruitville Road. And this problem pre-exists this amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to this amendment, without this amendment and its development, there's a mismatch between transportation and land use as it relates to Fruitville Road. There simply isn't enough future transportation facility identified to accommodate that growth that's occurring. So we already have a segment violating a level of service standard. The applicant's traffic analysis shows that extending, that level of service deficiency extending. And to cure the deficiencies, according to their analysis, Fruitville would have to be 6-lane from the interstate to Dog Kennel Road. And then 4-lane from there, clear out to the site of this amendment. But you know what? If you look at the county's long-range thoroughfare plan, it identifies the facilities they intend to have in place by the year 2040. It doesn't show 6 lanes and 4 lanes. It shows a section of 4 lanes and then the rest 2 lanes. So there's a mismatch already between land use and transportation.
Okay.
And then here we're throwing on top of that an additional 5,000 units that would be dependent on that road.
It's only going to make.
So there's a pre-existing community problem that would be worsened. So I think
I do need to interrupt you, Charlie. We need to take just remind my listeners, if you just joined me, I'm talking with Charlie Gauthier. He is working with the group who is trying to keep the country. And this meeting that's happening about a new application for 5,000 homes east of I-75 off of Fruitville Road in the rural area is going to be happening with the Sarasota County Commission on Wednesday, August 31st. So Wednesday, August 31st, the Sarasota County Commission will be considering this proposal that we're discussing. If you want to find out more about this meeting, you can go to scgov.net and look at the County Commission meetings and agendas. If you want to be sure to catch it, you probably should go when the meeting starts, because they do have a way of juggling their schedule these days. And so they give themselves now, the county gives themselves the flexibility to move hearings earlier if they choose to. But that's next Wednesday, August 31st, which is why we're talking about it today. So Charlie Gauthier, I want to ask you, you're sitting in front of the county commission right now, or let's say you're sitting in front of Nancy Dieter and you're speaking to this proposal, and we've talked about your extensive background, what you've seen in Florida, what you've seen in planning. What do you want to share with county commissioners about this particular proposal? What is it you think that they need to concern themselves with?
I would tell them that this is a profoundly significant amendment. It has great implications for the subject property and the balance of the 2050 plan, that the county would be well advised to slow down the process and look at it very hard, address the particular specific issues that this brings to the forefront. I mentioned this is a privately initiated amendment. It's moving fast. It has been the subject of minimal public participation requirements. And this is simply too important and too complex to rush ahead too quickly. So my advice to the board, and I have great respect for every elected board in the state, believe me, they have a very hard job, is to ask the hard questions. Send this back to the drawing board for more work. Require a collaborative process, and maybe some consensus approach could emerge. Maybe it doesn't have to be a hamlet per se, but some version that would capture the best ingredients of the hamlet, while at the same time accommodating the development desire of Lakewood Ranch.
Okay. You had mentioned the need for more public input. And in one of the memos I was reviewing regarding this is discussion of an inadequate neighborhood workshop. Can you talk about that? And then what does it look like? You know, what does the process look like when the neighborhood workshop has been done well, you know?
It would be more than one brief meeting via Zoom.
Okay. That's what happened, just one meeting?
But yes, and I did not participate in it. I don't have firsthand knowledge. That's the reports I've read.
Okay.
This amendment was introduced to the county commission prior to its formal application, has been the subject of that brief neighborhood workshop. And that's a very commendable requirement the county has in place that be carried out. And it has been subject to a planning commission meeting. Concerns have been raised at the planning commission meeting. And it was in fact a split vote, very significant question. So I think the need here goes beyond a simple neighborhood workshop or a sort of rollout, like here's what is moving forward. I think it has to be a genuine collaborative process to allow this to succeed in the best possible way. I mean, I have no problem with Lakewood Ranch expanding and wish Lakewood Ranch well, but I don't think they should displace the 2050 plan and rush through a major public decision through a privately driven process.
Yeah.
You know, this in my mind takes on the character of spot planning. It's a specialized, customized deal for one property owner. And it will have immediate ramifications and long-term consequences that, I mean, I've talked about some of them. Won't this grow in the future further and further east? Won't other village and hamlet developers want to reduce their requirement and want the same deal? So there's unknown consequences and could be very unintended, unexpected ramifications. So I think the policies governing the development need to be reshaped and tightened.
Okay.
To require mixtures of use, greater open space, urban design features that would draw people and promote walking. And I think the ramifications need to be thought through and controls put in place to manage those.
So tell me about incompatible land use, because again, that's another concern that's being raised about this proposal. What do you mean by incompatible, and how specifically is this proposal incompatible?
Yes, Florida statutes defines compatibility, and it's a little hard to get a handle on. It's like, can two land uses exist side by side in harmony? I mean, compatibility can be in the eye of the beholder. Very, very difficult at a zoning level. But what you want is a fairness of treatment and consistency of approach. In this instance, the underlying future land use is rural. The surrounding uses are principally rural. I mean, we have Burn Creek to the southeast. We do have elements of Lakewood Ranch to the north, but then you have farm fields. You do have a water and sewer site. So this is a agricultural and rural area, and plopped into this by a helicopter will be this blanket of uniform suburban development. And is that compatible? Is that compatible at a planning level? The clients who've asked me to review this certainly don't think it is. I mean, they're concerned about the effect on their rural lifestyle. I mean, Fruitville Road, going back to Fruitville Road, I mean, that's a road that the rural residents use for their daily travel. How
They're quite
compatible is it when
They're
the
quite
traffic is
dependent on Fruitville Road, aren't they? I mean,
Fruitville carries agricultural traffic. So not only would ag areas be chipped away and reduced, but their access to market would be curtailed. And Fruitville is also a hurricane evacuation route, a designated hurricane evacuation route. There's very few routes to get inland in any kind of time in Sarasota County.
yeah.
Fruitville is a key one. So I think there's in a bigger picture, a judgment call that this is a rural area eligible for hamlet and is appropriate to and compatible to drop in a threefold increase of single-use residential development. Is that compatible?
Yeah.
Can the lifestyle, the quiet rural lifestyle continue to exist with that as a neighbor?
Yeah.
So there's no sharp and clear definition of compatibility. And that's one of the hardest jobs for these elected officials, God love them, to try to find the balance. And again, I go back to my point that this is not a balanced proposal right now. Privately initiated, it's moving ahead expeditiously. My recommendation is to slow it down, look at a hard look at the issues, address the particulars, put in place safeguards to make sure this does not have a domino effect.
So, Charlie, people here really care about the environment. Most of us are transplants, most people who live here weren't born here, didn't grow up here, but certainly the beauty of Florida is one of the reasons people choose to live here. What do you anticipate the environmental impacts of this proposal would be versus if they designed it the way, the 2050 plan originally envisioned?
Well, at this stage, we are looking at a comprehensive plan change, but as a companion, there's a specific development proposal called a Development of County Concern, DOCC. And environmental issues would be more directly addressed through that subsequent process.
Okay.
But as I look at the site, about 700 acres of the site consists of 100-year floodplain. So some of it's flood prone.
Oh, wow.
There are wetlands, there are drainage ways, there are areas, limited areas, but areas of native habitat, pine flatwoods, oak hammocks. A hamlet is required to have 65% open space. And that open space is to be set aside in perpetuity for the purpose of environmental protection, to protect native plant communities, to allow for establishment of additional native vegetation, to provide for habitat. So hamlets are to have green belts, 65% open space. It is for environmental protection.
And the development is clustered, right? You get the same density, but it's more like a little town than
together.
Yeah, and so you've got a lot of open space around it, and that would serve both purposes, right? Protect the environment and give the developer the right to develop.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, this particular amendment, 38% open space. We're going from 65 to 38.
So pretty much in half. Right?
And the open space under the village transition zone, it's generous. It would also allow components of the development that are necessary to support development, such as stormwater ponds or retention ponds for non-potable water. It would allow communication towers. So it's a great reduction in open space and a more generous allowance of uses in that reduced open space. So
are
under
we
the scenario, yeah, you could protect the floodplains better through open space and those native vegetative communities and drainage ways.
So are we talking about cell phone towers when you say communication towers?
Yes, ma'am.
And yeah, so that's kind of a blight on a rural landscape. I mean, we've got to put them somewhere, but that doesn't look so great, right? I mean, I don't think so.
I wouldn't want to go out on my, in my rural
Well,
home
it's just
and look at the
another,
dark sky and see a blinking red light.
yeah, it's just another thing people live there to avoid, I would guess, is that kind of a structure. TDRs, is that something, that you want to address here? I mean, I've talked before, this has been a while ago on the show, transfer of development rights is a way to actually protect land from being developed. And the example I like to use is like in New Jersey, farmers were just getting offered tons of money to sell their farmland, and communities got really concerned because obviously the food is needed. So the governments developed what was called TDRs, where the farmers could be paid for their development rights. They could realize and draw some of the value of the land out, but then those development rights would be transferred to areas where the city or county would say, you're going to pay the farmer, but we're going to let you build here. You're not going to take over the farm. How do they apply to this development, or do they? Maybe they don't at all.
Minimally.
Okay.
They could potentially transfer development rights into this development. I think they would earn as a matter of right over 4,100 dwelling units, and they could reach their cap of 5,000 dwelling units by providing community housing, that's more affordable as an incentive, or they could reach that ultimate cap of 5,000 by transferring in development. But they're given off the top, I'd call it gifted by the local government, over 4,000 dwelling units.
In this proposal?
Yes. Now, contrast that to the village requirements under the 2050 plan. The density in villages is achieved through transfer of development rights. You have to acquire and transfer that rights. You earn your density.
Meaning, and so the practical promise of that is you actually do preserve open space.
Exactly.
But in this proposal, they're just being given extra development rights. Am I?
80% of the development rights are simply given, not earned.
Wow.
And a TDR program, and some have been very successful, it requires a market. And you don't have a market if by the stroke of a pen, you're given units. Why do you go out and buy and transfer in development, set aside that green belt or ag area when it's so readily available? So this is another way that I have concerns about this amendment, that instead of earning its density through TDR, the majority of the density is simply a gift from local government.
Unfortunately, I have to say, there's a story. It's Lakewood Ranch. There was an environmentally sensitive piece of land called Gum Slough, and we have a program where it's called the Environmentally Sensitive Lands Protection Program, and Sarasota County paid Schrader Manatee Ranch, the same as the applicant, $7 million to retire the development rights, and in return, Gum Slough was protected. That was in 2003. 7 years later, and almost immediately, Mr. Jensen complained that the 2050 plan didn't work. his development rights had gone down from 5,000, he lost 5,000 units, I believe it was. He said, this isn't economically feasible for me, or it might have been 2,500. What happened in 2010 was all of the development rights were gifted back to him. They called them something else, open space credits, but the open space credits were for the area that he had already promised to keep open, that we paid $7 million for. The bottom line is Sarasota taxpayers paid $7 million and to Mr. Jensen, and he didn't lose a thing because 7 years later, the development rights went back to him. And so when you're telling me development rights are being gifted, I guess my answer is it's not the first time I've seen that. You know,
Well, it's the traditional approach around the state of Florida. Those
okay.
urban development boundaries I mentioned. Well, the land outside that boundary is cheaper. And these development companies
Mhm.
have a organizational infrastructure that needs more land. They know how to process land into development.
Mhm.
It's cheaper to seek and approve approvals outside the urban development area than it is to buy land within that urban area.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
a machinery that always needs to consume more land. And they certainly have their styles and products that they want. Now, I do want to add, since we're kind of getting toward the end,
Yes.
I have concerns, immediate concerns, and concerns about the long-term consequences. But I do not in any way want to disparage Lakewood Ranch and the
Mhm.
development success they've achieved.
Mhm.
Again, I think consumer preference is very important. We want
Mhm.
something that's going to work and help them succeed, but at the same time, honor the planning that has gone into the 2050 plan.
Mhm.
So the Board of County Commissioners at their hearing next week, I mean, they have a tremendous challenge to try to find this balance.
Mhm.
But again, I think the best approach is to slow it down, bring in much more public involvement, go back to the drawing board,
Mhm.
work it out, try to find a balanced approach.
Yeah. Do you think that the truly classically designed hamlet would do that or could do that? I mean,
It could
obviously.
do that.
Mhm.
Uh, the
Okay.
the proof is in the pudding. The
Okay.
details mean everything.
Mhm.
And when you go from an idealized plan to the reality of putting something on the ground, it gets more complicated. That's why I said earlier on, plants aren't locked in cement. They
Okay.
need to evolve and respond. And so fine tuning and adjustments, I think, are very appropriate. But that's not what we have here.
Okay. Okay. So, if things were to go well, or if people wanted to share um, their point of view, what do you think is a reasonable expectation? You're saying, slow it down, but ultimately, what do you think people can ask for and expect the county to entertain, instead of just going up there and saying this is a bad idea?
Well, I think so going up to that podium, it's very difficult for
Yeah.
citizens to find the time, to travel to the courthouse, to sit in the audience, to actually stand up. I get scared when I do it. So
You've done it a lot. You've done
I do it a lot.
hundreds of times.
Um, but I think you need to do more than simply say I oppose something. I think
Mhm.
constructive alternatives that they might bring forward would be very helpful. I think a
Yeah.
cooperative spirit is needed. It shouldn't be just all yes or all no.
Mhm.
I think there could be a middle ground compromise that preserves the integrity of the 2050 plan and
Mhm.
allows Lakewood Ranch to move forward with something that resembles but isn't identical to what we see in Manatee County. So I think constructive advice is very helpful.
Mhm.
Let me add, I'm just completing a written report with my assessment. I've prepared it, independently, and it's what I think, and we'll be sending that out this afternoon. And
Oh,
it's
okay, great.
hoping that it's constructive and will be helpful to the county.
Mhm.
But there are very real problems with what we have before us now.
Mhm.
I'd be alarmed if it just blindly moves forward.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Lord knows, I think all around the state of Florida, but particularly Sarasota and Manatee County is one of the fastest growing areas in the country. And
Absolutely.
there's some, you know, blessings with that, but then there are problems with that. And I know anyone who travels along Fruitville Road or has to use Fruitville out east has noticed big changes. And so, well, I'll look forward to reading your report and looking at maybe even attending the meeting and seeing how we move forward together as a community. Charles Gauthier, if people want to find out more about your work or about Florida's, development history in general, is there anywhere that you recommend they check out? Or
Google.
Google, okay,
Google.
Google.
Well, the
You
county,
haven't written a book or anything like that
no,
about this.
no,
Okay,
I'm more a practitioner. But I'd say
okay,
the county's planning and zoning website has a wealth of information, very,
that's
very
true.
helpful. So I think
Mhm,
that's quite commendable. Including they have a online GIS mapping function where you
mhm.
could look at all kinds of things. So I think you could find the history of growth management here and there via Google, and then zoom in using that planning and zoning website and
On
take advantage of their resources in their library. It's quite good.
Okay. All right. Well, Charlie Gauthier, thank you so much for joining me today. Everyone, you've been listening to the detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. Next Wednesday, August 31st, is when the County Commission is going to be considering approving or revisiting the application we've been talking about, changing the comprehensive plan, making modifications for proposed development out east. And your neighbors in Old Miakka would love you to join them. You can find out more information at scgov.net. You can look at the development information as Charlie recommends. But make a note on your calendar, Wednesday, August 31st, the Sarasota County Commission meeting at 1660 Ringling Boulevard. Thank you all so much for listening to us, and stay tuned for more public affairs programming here on WSLR. Make it a great day.